Hey everyone, we'll get started. So I'm Chris. So just to start, I'll introduce what the club is and what we have planned for the event. To start, we'd like to recognize that McGill is on the land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe Nation. To introduce our club, before we get started with the panel, Law and Political Economy is a new club at McGill this year, which Grace and I started in the summer. And the LPE team also includes Blaze, Carolina, Clarissa, and Ashley, who are mostly all here today, as well as some general members who've been participating throughout the year. And this is our first event, so we're excited to get started. The club is a chapter of a broader organization in the US that has chapters at many US law schools called the LPE, or Law and Political Economy Project. And the idea of LPE is to look at the ways that the law structures the economy and politics and how the law can contribute to a fairer and more democratic society. As mentioned, most chapters are in the US, and there's only one other one in Canada at the University of Victoria. So with LPE McGill, we want to explore these ideas in the Canadian context and examine how things in Canada might be different and what things might be similar. In addition to this event, our club has hosted a couple of reading group sessions with our general members, where we usually take an article from the Law and Political Economy blog and discuss it for an hour or so, usually during universal break or after class in the afternoon, and everyone's always welcome to join. There's also some DCL students here at McGill who've organized another reading group that's a bit more theoretical about LP ideas. Some of them may be here today, but they kind of run that separately from us, but are still participating in the club. And some of them are likely going to present their research to the club at some point, as well as general members to kind of have a discussion of their research and hopefully come up with some interesting feedback for them. So this event we wanted to organize because housing is an area that's very clearly has an intersection between law, the housing market, and the political choices that can either alleviate or exacerbate housing issues. And we partnered with RadLaw for this event because they have a lot of connections to community organizations working in this space. And we've set up a panel of people involved in various Montreal housing organizations and homelessness organizations who can discuss the current state of housing and homelessness in Montreal, as well as key issues and possibilities for change. Grace will be moderating the platform with some prepared, the panel with some prepared questions. We'll also have time for some Q&A at the end. To start, each of the panelists are going to give a brief introduction of themselves and their work, and then we'll move on to questions. So I'll let Grace take the lead on that. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on actually a really beautifully snowy day. So I'm Grace, and I'll be moderating the panel. And we also have some folks joining in on Zoom. So if could somebody on Zoom just confirm that you can hear us all right? That would be great. So yeah, as Chris has mentioned, we're really happy that you're joining us. Okay, perfect. Nicole said that she can hear us. We're really happy that you can join us for this event. And that the room is really full. It's a little like separated, so hopefully we'll sort of create more of a collegial environment as the panel gets going. So housing and the homelessness crisis in Montreal, Quebec, around Canada and the world are an undeniable reality we are facing. In Montreal, new housing price index in Montreal rose by 314% between 2000 and 2022, which is a more significant shift than that experienced by LA, San Francisco, and New York in that time. Many homeless shelters in Montreal are operating at unprecedented demands and full capacity, and the pandemic has ushered in increases of visible homelessness. So I am joined by 4 fantastic panelists to discuss the facts and underlying issues that underpin these twin crises and how law can support and or hinder the movement towards affordable housing and homelessness prevention. So since our audience is likely quite diverse, some of you may be more familiar with these topics and some less, and I'm like right along with you. I'll be learning along the way as well. So as Chris said, we'll start off with some short presentations by each of our panelists to so that they can discuss how their organizations work and how the ties to matters related to law and political economy. Then we'll have a panel discussion for around half an hour to deepen the explorations on the historical context, the present endeavors, and future outlook that all contribute to understanding and improving housing and homelessness. And finally, we really want to open up the floor to all of you. So we have Alana, Georges, Sue, and Emily. So I'd like to start with Alana, who's a coordinator at the Housing Department of Vivre en Ville. And just to give a quick background, Vivre en Ville is a public interest organization that contributes to the development of sustainable communities throughout Quebec. They help bring change on all scales, from the building and the street to the neighborhood and the urban area, through research, training, consulting, advocacy, and awareness. So Alana, I'll pass it on to you first.
Thank you, Grace. So as she very well, I couldn't even find that in English. You translated that?
People.
Yes. Great. Vivre en Ville mostly works in French. We're trying to broaden our horizons, but they're already quite broad, as Grace has just explained. We're essentially a policy think tank that also does service conseil, accompagnement, training, amongst many, many other services. But what the housing department does specifically is work on a variety of projects, such as Porte Ouverte, that just came out. So a publication that talks about 4 main doors to open to solve the housing crisis. And we, amongst other things, we work on the registry. So the rental registry is the project that I've been running since I've arrived at Vivre en Ville last year, but it has been around since 2017. What is a rental registry? It's a website where you can input your rent, the amount, the address, and the date of the lease, and share it with your neighbors and your community. Why? Because in the civil codes, I think it's article 1950, it clearly states that in a lease, you're supposed to fill the G clause, which requires the landlord to put the lowest amount paid in the last 12 months for the unit itself. So that is to protect the vacancy control. Luckily enough, in Quebec, we have vacancy control, such as in PEI and Manitoba, and the rest of Canada has rent control. So we're lucky in that sense that we have a law that's already existing in Quebec, but we're unlucky in this other sense that we don't have a real concrete way to apply it and protect people that should be benefiting from this law. So what we've been doing at Vivre en Ville is we got funding from the CMHC, so the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, to build a new site that is safer, better, more accessible, and overall just a perfect product so that we can come to the provincial government and say, we've done it, take it. To get to that, we are currently in the development phases of the website, but we still are running the old one. If you ever want to put in your rent, if you ever want to check it out, it's myrent.quebec in English, or monloyer.quebec, or registre-des-loyers.quebec. We don't have rental registry, do we? No, so just in French. Adam over here also works at Vivre en Ville. I might refer to him in the next few minutes if I have any questions, and please feel free to go ask him questions after the presentation as well. So we're in the web development phases, and we will be launching a media campaign. We'll be launching a public affairs campaign, all that in the hopes of, like I said, getting the provincial government to adopt a rental registry. This is something that many tenant unions and tenant advocacy, organizations have also been asking for since the dawn of time. And this is always something that is essentially put down lately due to expenses. According to the provincial government in 2021, they had said a rental registry would cost $56 million. to create and to put in place, and would cost about $30 million a year to keep going. So Vivre-en-Ville is happy to say that we will have done this for under $2 million, and we will keep running it for way less than that every year. All in the hopes that we can change the Relevé 31, which is the tax form that landlords can fill and adds that tenants can fill, or anyone in Quebec can fill, and adds the amount of rent. So we can simplify the crowdsourcing into an automatic input of that information into the system, and get ultimately not just the application of the law, that's mostly what we aim for. We want everyone to be part of a fair market. We want to make sure that when it comes to rents and relationships between landlords and tenants, that ultimately everyone is on the same level. And we don't just want that for tenants, we want that for landlords as well. I think a misconception often about the rental registry is that it'll only help tenants, but that's not quite the case. It'll help landlords that are following the law to keep a fair game. If you are the only one that's following the law and everyone else is cutting corners, obviously at some point you'll have two options: either quit the game or cut corners yourself. So we want to prevent that as well. I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alana. And I'm looking forward to chatting more about the rental registry and other initiatives on improving housing affordability that Vivre-en-Ville is doing. And so next we'll have Sue. So Sue is an activist and a social rights advocate and also writer at Project Genesis. Project Genesis is a grassroots nonprofit community organization located in Côte-des-Neiges, which is a very diverse neighborhood of Montreal where many people live below the poverty line. Project Genesis supports neighborhood residents in facing and resolving some of their difficult challenges, which includes housing problems, basic income security, and access to healthcare and other government programs. So Project Genesis, and I'm sure Sue can talk more about it, sees the links between individual problems and broader social inequities. And so they provide services that help people resolve individual difficulties while also working on their root causes. So Sue, if you could tell us a bit more about your work at Project Genesis, that would be great.
Great, thank you. Hi. So I always start off these things by saying that I'm from New York. I don't know why, especially when I'm doing it in French, then everyone feels like, oh, wow, your accent, you're not as bad as we thought. Anyway, but I mention that because I was actually a housing lawyer in New York City. I worked for a number of different housing organizations, including legal services, and with both tenants and tenant associations. And then when we immigrated and came to Montreal, I started working at Project Genesis and doing a lot of the same work, but rather than representing tenants, what we do there is we give out legal information and we help people advocate for themselves. And so we have the storefront, which is which until COVID was a walk-in legal information clinic. And also people could call, and then during COVID, it became more of a, you can call, and now it's appointments and phone calls. We work hand in hand with our community organizers who are working collectively on the same issues that we're working on individually, which is something I've always liked to do. Even in my work in New York, I always enjoyed working for organizations that had both tenant lawyers and tenant organizers. This is really a good way to tackle a problem from both the individual and collective perspective. So Project Genesis works on, has two organizing committees, one on housing rights and one on anti-poverty. And in the storefront, we see a lot of the issues that were mentioned: housing, welfare, pension, RAMQ, different kinds of things with a very diverse population. And though we're located in Côte-des-Neiges, we're actually open to anybody, like even outside of Quebec. We even get calls from people from like everywhere. It's kind of crazy. We've been around for 45 years or so. And so I don't forget it, I'm just going to give a plug, because we work with volunteers and students and stagiaires and pro bonos, and we hire people in the summer. So if anyone's interested in this kind of work, please get in touch. We would love to have you either through your legal clinic or over the summer or just as volunteers. So, yeah, so I think that's enough to start.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Sue. I know that like with the McGill Legal Information Clinic, like oftentimes we'll refer to people to Project Genesis if they have like rental or housing issues and things like that for some more specific help. So next we have Emily, who's a McGill Law alum and housing rights advocate, and she's currently project manager for the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Policy Collaborative, which is a cross-sectoral policy collaborative focused on advancing reform to actively help prevent homelessness in Quebec. So the collaborative strives to present policy options that will be the catalyst for the amendment of existing laws or the adoption of new laws, regulations, policies, programs, and budgets that will result in significantly fewer people entering or re-entering homelessness. And I know this is a rather new collaborative, so Emily, could you tell us a bit more about the work that you've been doing with it?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really nice to be back here with a few faces that I recognize from classes. So I graduated at the end of 2021, took some time off to recover from law school, decided not to practice. And so I was more interested in doing policy work, legal research, and like public legal education. So after taking a little recovery period, I joined it's called the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Policy Collaborative. I'm going to refer to it as the QHPPC just because it's a little shorter. And the idea of the collaborative is to bring together academic researchers from universities, people working in the community sector, and then also people working in the public sector to try and come together, conduct research or mobilize research to better understand some of the pathways into homelessness. So what are the systemic or the structural causes that are increasing risk of homelessness, and then developing like policy proposals to try and prevent those or to lead to policy or legislative reforms. And so at the moment, we have 5 different working groups who are doing research, sort of focusing on specific populations. So we have some looking at ways of preventing homelessness for folks who are experiencing mental health issues, people experiencing intimate partner violence, people with precarious immigration status, youth, and people who are judicialized and go through the carceral system. And this year we're building on an eviction prevention research stream, an affordable housing research stream, and also on Indigenous homelessness. So to kind of give you an example of what some of our groups are working on, we have a justice and corrections working group from across different sectors, and what they've done for their research is kind of map out the trajectory of someone who's been criminalized and passing through the justice system through carceral institutions. And this is a group that is at much higher risk of becoming unhoused once they're released from carceral institutions. And so the group is trying to identify what are some of these like points along that trajectory that might increase the risk of them finding themselves homeless once they're released. And so, for example, one of the policies that we've identified is if the person in Quebec is incarcerated for more than 5 weeks, they're completely cut off from their social assistance, and they are not eligible to reapply for social assistance until after they're released. And so that means for a lot of them, they don't get their first check for at least a month. And so after 5 weeks of incarceration, many of them will be evicted because they can't keep paying their rent. Oftentimes we've had folks tell us like, once they're evicted while they're incarcerated, all of their stuff is just thrown out. And so they're starting from scratch. So trying to understand more, what are these kinds of policies that we can target? And then what we do is do like outreach and mobilization. Our first policy report was published in November, and that was our gender and intimate partner violence research stream. They released a policy paper with a list of recommendations, and now we're meeting with members of the National Assembly, trying to advocate for some of these legislative reforms, like implementing a right to adequate housing in Quebec law, which exists at the federal level and internationally, but not here. And so we're meeting with MNAs, we're meeting with city officials to try and push for some of these reforms to reduce, instances of precarious housing, reduce the number of evictions that we're seeing, and to try and prevent homelessness. Because what we've seen, there's
There's not a ton of data on it. They do like point in time counts to understand how many people are experiencing homelessness in the province. That just gives you the tip of the iceberg because they count on one given day or one given night, the people that you can observably see in shelters, in public spaces and metros, but that doesn't capture all the folks who experience hidden homelessness or couch surfing or staying with friends. And so, but what we do know from the community sector, and I'm sure Sue can attest to this, we're seeing more and more people who are being evicted, who are experiencing precarious housing, and who are finding themselves unhoused for the first time. And the pandemic seems to have exacerbated that. And so in response, OBM, the Old Brewery Mission teamed up with McGill to launch this policy collaborative. So it's like a joint partnership. And that's it for me.
All right, thanks, Emily. And so speaking about Old Brewery Mission, we also have George Ohana, who is currently the Director of Homelessness Prevention and Research at the OBM. And he's also former Director of Housing and Support Services at the OBM. And so the Old Brewery Mission provides a range of services that responds to the needs of Montreal's homeless people, as well as those at risk of becoming so, and endeavors to enable them to take control of their lives and assume their rightful place in the community. And the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Policy Collaborative is a joint project between OBM and the McGill Institute for Health and Social Policy. So Georges, if you can speak more to your work at OBM, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Perfect. I'll try to be bilingual because I hope that most of you guys are able to understand French or speak French and English. So I'll do my best in both languages. It's important for you guys to know that the mission was created in 1889, so 135 years. In those years, the major concept of homelessness was how to treat homelessness. And through the decades, you saw different philosophies in terms of how to approach homelessness. It's only in 2021 that the mission launched a prevention team. So practically a greenfield. Nothing was done in terms of how to think of homelessness before they became homelessness. So you're opening Pandora's box in terms of being able to understand where are these individuals coming from and what can we do so that they don't live through the trauma of becoming homeless. So it's a major shift in terms of how the mission is thinking, in terms of being able to reduce the numbers of homeless men and women that you see on the streets. What it entails is, where do you start? What do you do? The issues are so huge that it's difficult for individuals to be able to wrap their heads around it, to talk to politicians and to get promises more often than not. From where I stand in terms of ground level, nothing really happens for more than a few years. So I'll tell you what I've done since 2006 and what I've done over the course of the last 18 months. When I started in 2006, we had no social housing. You had a bed, a shower, and the next morning, you were back on the street. So I knew people when I started off that had 25 years of just going through the same infernal cycle of having a shower, having a hot meal, having a bed, and then getting back and going through the same ordeal. Things have radically changed where the mission has opened its doors so that they're able to keep individuals inside a shelter system, which is not fit for humans, but that's what we have. And to be able to start thinking in terms of what should be their next step. What are the solutions to homelessness? But again, that's in a closed system in terms of they've become homeless. And then what do we do with them? Where I've been able, so over the course of the last 15 years, we've been able, in terms of the ebb and flow, in terms of funding, which is a major, major issue, we've been able to get 300 social housing projects or units working. And then depending on the year, we might get more, and then we might lose more, but we have to fight each year to be able to maintain this sense of core budget for us to be able to follow through. Over the course of the last year or 18 months is being able to pinpoint what is called in French, point de bascule. In English, would be the tipping point, where the individual, against his will, finds himself confronted with a position where he has no other choice than to become homeless. So I'll give you a few examples and the pilot projects. So I'm working from really ground level and trying to change the way people think. And then eventually get to be able to meet individuals that have the necessary torque to be able to go back down and to say, well, this pilot project works. Why don't we try to apply this to the different levels of government? So I'll give you a very easy example in terms of housing. I am not necessarily the director of prevention, but I'm the director of des bouteilles à la mer. So there's a concept that it's more romantic than anything, where you take a bottle, you put a letter, and then you throw it into the sea, and then you hope that eventually someone's going to pick it up. So that's what I do. I send emails to people that I don't know, cold call, and I said, could we work together? Could we decide on what would be the best way to be able to reduce homelessness? So I did get a call back from l'Office Municipal d'Habitation de Montréal, which is the major housing regime, or whatever you want to call it, in Quebec. And they said, we have a major issue, which is the 1st of July. On the 1st of July, as you know, is a major tipping point in terms of people losing their housing opportunities. But that's never true, because it's never the 1st of July when they're asked to move. It happens during the whole year because of the crisis that we're going through. So they called us in and they said, what can be done to the 100 to 300 individuals that we meet over the course of a year, and we have no idea what to do with? We put in motels, and we hope that we're able to find something for them. But more often than not, there's just a parking spot for them to be able to go through, more often than not, nothing, and then find themselves in a homeless environment. So with a very small team, what we're trying to do, and we've signed une entente de collaboration with l'Office Municipal, which is a major step, is to be able to meet each of these individuals that are desperately alone, that are in motels and hotels, and ask them, what's your next step? And to be able to orient, to accompany these individuals. So this is how I'm hoping to change the system from within, trying to build on des ententes de collaboration, so that eventually the people pretty up in terms of Quebec are able to see how these pilot projects with research are able to give them a sense of, we could do things differently.
Thank you so much. So thank you for providing a great overview of the work you've done. And I think first, what I'd like to hear a bit more about are from what do the people affected, what are they going through, and how have these issues changed throughout the years? So I have a specific question for Georges and Sue, and also Emily and Alana, if you'd like to bring in your perspective as well. So Georges, you've worked at OBM for over 16 years now. Since you started, what are the biggest and most common barriers you've seen your clients face in the legal system? And Sue, similarly, in the course of your work at Project Genesis, what is the nature of the problems you've witnessed among your clientele, and how or have not these housing related challenges evolved over time? Have there been certain types of problems that have become more acute in recent years? So Sue and Georges, I'll let you talk a bit more about that.
Okay, so very easily, one of the major issues. So before working at the mission, I only worked in terms of psychosocial. So being able to help individuals. One of the main issues that I've been able to see is the inability for people to be able to understand what's written on a piece of paper. They do get documentation, but they're unable to read and understand it. So there might be a lot of words that they don't understand, and it's a time to be able to push anxiety down, being able to go through the exercise of going through this translation and being able to accompany these individuals. More often than not, they will abide by every law, every bylaw that they're presented with. But the main issue that I see over my experience is their inability to be able to ask questions to get proper answers. More often than not, there's going to be this knee-jerk reaction where I don't understand, and then they're going to have this sense of pushing things away, not thinking about it. They forget that there are elements that they need to answer, and by not answering them, they're pushing themselves closer to homelessness. So I would say it has more to do with the capacity to be able to have this kind of mediation, this kind of translation that is necessary for people to be able to feel that they've been understood and they're able to move on.
Interesting. So as I mentioned before, I come from New York City, which has for a very, very long time had a overheated, crazy, housing market where things are extraordinarily expensive. And when I first came here, so I've been working at Project Genesis for almost 18 years. And what I've seen in the course of that time is a drastic move more towards like the scenario we have, unfortunately, in New York City. When I first came here and people told me one of the biggest problems facing tenants was delays at the rental board. And I thought, that's insane. And in New York, it's the landlords who complain about delays because they can't just evict people fast enough. And I didn't really understand how did that fit into this scenario. And I started learning about how the rental board works, that it's actually not even a first come, first served system. It's like landlords' cases get prioritized over tenants' cases because non-payments are considered to be urgent, whereas someone complaining about decent conditions in their apartment and lack of repairs, that's not considered to be urgent, so it goes to the bottom of the list. And we saw people being evicted, but we also saw that people who were evicted could find another apartment, even if they were evicted in a lot of the cases, because the rents were reasonable enough. And I was surprised actually that landlords actually went after tenants who broke their leases without permission and tried to sue them for damages. In New York City, if someone left their apartment early, the landlord would throw a party. Like that was the reaction. And here it was like, no, we've just lost our tenant. We've just lost the revenue stream. We're going to sue you. And so now what we're seeing is a situation where all kinds of landlords are using all kinds of the sleazy tricks that I saw for many, many years in New York City and did not see here for the first, let's say, at least 10 years of my time working at Project Genesis. We see people who can't find apartments because they're way too expensive, and a city that actually doesn't really help them very much at all. Like nobody barely will actually accompany someone to find another apartment. And we're seeing all kinds of heat ups in all different types of evictions, repossessions, evictions for subdivision and change in destination, rent eviction, which maybe probably a lot of you have heard about, just landlords saying, oh, I'm renovating, you have to go, which of course isn't the way the law works. And yeah, I mean, just that to me is the most dramatic change. And so finally, for kind of the first time, people were talking about rent registration for a while, but people are now seriously trying to fight for rent control. One of the things that Quebec has that other jurisdictions don't have, which is great, and I was so pleased when I moved here, was that most tenants have the right to continued possession of their premises. So you have a right to a renewal lease, except in very narrow situations where the landlord could not renew your lease. And that's awesome because so many places don't have that, right? But what Quebec really doesn't have is a rent control system. Like what we call rent control here is kind of a joke, in my opinion. And it's all based on just individuals knowing enough to try to assert their rights and not being scared out of it. And if they don't, well, that's the rent forever. Like there's no, like, So for the last few years I just came actually straight from this morning. I was at a demonstration against the rising rents. We went to Corpic, sorry, no, that was actually on purpose. To demonstrate against the huge inflation of rents. Every year, the Tribunal, which is what they use now, the rent board is the Tribunal Administratif de Logement, comes down with percentages that are supposed to guide tenants and landlords into figuring out what the increase can be. And the numbers have completely exploded, and it's really quite unclear what these numbers are based on. In New York City, they happen in smoke-filled rooms. Here, I'm not sure who's in the rooms or whether they're smoke-filled or not, but the numbers are just insane. They're just insane. It used to be we would say like, oh, let's figure out, is this a good rent increase? I mean, and now it's just like, I'm really tempted to just say, just refuse everything. Because this has to stop. This has to stop. No one is going to be able to afford their rents anymore. And of course, it's in a context where social housing, we talk about the Ohana, they're supposed to be providing social housing. Someone comes and they apply for social housing, they're on the waiting list for 7 years. I mean, it's like people think that's the solution. Oh, can I apply for social housing? Because I'm being evicted in 2 months. It's like, yeah, you can, but maybe if we go into a time machine, you'll have a social housing, apartment. So that's the kind of changes that I've seen over the last 18 years, and they're very, very disquieting. And it's really time. I think it's really time where we have to make some major changes. And when it's time to talk about that, I'll give you my list. So
Yes, I was, please jump in.
So that's one of the things we're seeing a lot, and in Montreal, I think historically has been known as kind of like a small landlord market. This idea that it was like, a landlord who would own like 1, 2, 3 units maybe, or maybe have a duplex and then live on the first floor. And I think we're starting to see this massive shift that places like New York have probably already been through, and Toronto and Vancouver, and we're starting to see what they call like the financialization of housing. So housing becoming this commodity for investment, right? And so we're seeing, instead of it being small landlords in Montreal, we're seeing more and more of these large corporations or real estate investment funds buying up housing stock rapidly. They have big purses, so they can just try and like pay out any kind of rent eviction payments. They don't mind going to the tribunal and going to like rent evicting or basically evicting like whole apartment units. And that completely changes the game in the market. And we're seeing, I think, huge increases in rent because of these kinds of things. Suddenly the housing market is supposed to be like a return on your investment. And for large like, real estate investment funds, people's retirements are kind of this. And I think that drastically changes like the face of our rental market. And I think in Montreal, maybe I'll Quebec, I'm not sure, like 90% of our rental market is private. So if you're letting these large corporations just buy that up and increase rent or rent evict people, that's impacting 90% of renters, whereas only 10% of rent in the city is subsidized for social housing. So it's not a ton.
Alana, I was wondering if you had anything to add, like if these sort of trends have resonated in the work that you've done.
Of course, I think the financialization of, I'm sorry, I can't speak, of housing is an enormous issue. Companies like BlackRock coming in and bringing essentially what is a human right, the right to housing, in competition with the stock market, and that whole world is in complete contradiction of basic sense. I think that often situations happen because people put them in place. And currently we are living at the mercy of decisions that were made by people who wanted this to happen, who wanted to gain this power without seeing the people behind the numbers. In housing, there's this saying of when someone owns a building or units, they call them doors, des portes. And it's again like dehumanizes that whole idea. And that is still more, I would say, okay, than bringing in numbers and stocks and profits at such a giant level that are companies like that. And so obviously the effects happen everywhere in everyone's day-to-day life. My own landlord tried to have me out of my apartment last week. And the only solution that we have is knowing our rights. So I'm concurring to all three. The biggest barrier is that that we don't just need to adjust and adapt policy, that we don't just need to make it better or apply it better. We need people to know what their rights are, and that's often when it's misused or mishandled. So the effects of big money playing with big numbers affecting real life people in everyday moments are, I find, felt more and more throughout everything that we do at Vivre en Ville, because the less power that you have as a citizen, the less time that you may have to be involved in that change that needs to happen, to be involved in that awareness that you need to share with others. And so when it comes to working in public policy change or like understanding, I think it's very important for us to come back to that human factor. Like there's no point in launching a pilot and bringing it at scale if you haven't proven that it works at a human scale, and then creating that policy and applying it. So I may have lost my train of thought here, but it affects everything that we do at Vivre en Ville. We try to bring people together and to change policies so that everyone lives in a sustainable collectivity, not just a community. We want everyone to be able to live in a pocket that they can feel comfortable and feel like their needs are met. And housing is obviously often the first one, because once you have housing, once you have a place to stay, the other things will often follow suit. So I concur. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like there's a lot of different actors in play, whether it's like obstructing or progressing sort of these issues. And I was wondering, like, in terms of the specific like social, political, and economic fabric and history of Montreal and Quebec, do you think there are any strengths that can be leveraged, whether it's like within communities, whether it's like sort of types of individual beliefs that might be more salient in Quebec that can be used to advance the fight for affordable housing? Or, you know, are we kind of the same as like everywhere else and going down the same path? I think anybody who would like to start off.
I'll jump in. The immigrant will jump in to that question. Not that I know a lot about the history of Quebec, but maybe an outsider's perspective is interesting, because I do find that Quebec has a much more sense of social solidarity than, and Canada as a whole, but Quebec in particular, that that there's this concept of social solidarity, of dare I say socialism even, where it's not all about competition and the market. There's a belief that we have responsibilities towards one another, that our government has a responsibility towards us, and that people have rights. I mean, hey, we get to go to doctors for free. I'm still standing by the door waiting for my bill, and then I'm like remembering, oh yeah, I don't get a bill, yay. So we already have a sort of a groundwork for the idea that people have rights, human rights. We have a right to health. And I believe that we have a right to housing. And of course, we have a right to be able to live in dignity. And I think that there is something in the fabric of this society that has that sort of consciousness about that. And we need to push on that more, and not kind of try to become more like our neighbor to the south, where it's all about money and competition, and this false idea that then everything will trickle down and be fine, when we all know that's false and that's not how it really works. Or I don't know if we all know that, but I know that. I should speak for myself. So yeah, I do think that there's hope to pull on those ideas, and that we can build from that concept that, say, speaking of housing, which is what we're speaking of today, mostly, that is a right that people have, and that it needs to be enshrined in the law and in our society. And then we need to make policy around that, even if that means some people get less rich.
Emily, it seemed like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I can jump in. I get excited about the idea of the right to housing. It's one of the things that the QHPPC has been advocating for, especially from the release of our first policy paper in November. That's been something we've been doing, is knocking on the doors of members of the National Assembly to say, we strongly urge you to legislate the right to housing under Quebec law. It exists under federal law, under the National Right to Housing Act, National Housing Strategy Act, and it exists also under international law, and the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights. So this right already exists, but it doesn't exist under Quebec law. So we're urging them to amend the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, which is already quite a robust human rights code, one of the most in Canada, I would argue, but we don't have a recognized right to housing. And some, I think, look at us and think, well, that's aspirational, what's it really going to do? But I think it gives us a really solid framework to recognize that this is a matter of human rights. It also builds in accountability mechanisms. So at the federal level, we now have a federal housing advocate, and her name is Vanjou, and what she does is to take, proposals from individuals to say, identify systemic housing issues across the country, investigate them, make recommendations to the federal government, who's then legally obligated to respond. Whether they implement them or not is another thing. But in Quebec, we don't have that kind of mechanism yet. So enshrining the right to housing brings like more accountability mechanisms, reporting obligations to gather more data. And I think really importantly comes this obligation of, it's called the progressive realization of the right to housing. So it doesn't mean you can take the government to court and say, I want a house on this street. But what it does is it means that the government has this obligation to progressively realize the right to housing for all, which means they're meant to use the maximum available resources to achieve this right in the shortest amount of time. So they're meant to change laws and policies with the idea that housing is a human right. So at the moment, we're meant to be bound by these higher laws, but we don't have it in the Quebec Charter. And I think that's something that should change. And I really agree with Sue in the sense that Quebec actually has quite robust tenant rights. It's totally different. Knowing your rights and being able to actually advocate for them and implement them is another thing. And I think that's a huge barrier. But we do have pretty robust tenants laws, and I think we need to fight to protect them, and we need to mobilize so that people have the capacity to really be able to fight for those rights and actually, see the obligations of the government to actually recognize them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the right to housing is a newer, but also really interesting and pressing topic. And I was wondering, with Georges and Alana, with your work, if a right to housing specifically in Quebec was implemented, how do you think it would impact the work that you're doing in your respective organizations? Would it fast track, let's say, fight to get some more social housing? Would it sort of put pressure on the provincial government to implement a registry? How do you think a right to housing could impact the work in your organizations?
So I'll give you the previous question is still in my head. But the question that you're asking right now, I'll give you the example of Austria. In Austria, when someone is close to being evicted or before becoming or close to, the government has allocated funds so that they reach out to the individual during the process of them being evicted, and they're finding pathways for them not to find themselves homeless. Why? Not because of the goodwill of the government, because it's the law. It's a huge difference. Here, we're hitting the wall because most of the work that is being done is by community organizations. So as soon as you hit that wall, and it happens quite often because we have very, very few funding opportunities, our reach is so limited. By being able to have laws, the paradigm shifts where government is asking for community to be a part of the solution. which is a very different way of doing business. Right now, we are pleading with government to recognize the fact that we have a problem. We go through editorials, we go through newspapers to be able to recognize, not only during the winter, but during the whole year, we have an outstanding issue when it comes to housing or homelessness. By having law, we are able to push government to recognize their obligation towards its own citizens.
Vienna is a great example for anything housing related. They're quite exemplary. And I think I obviously totally agree with George that it's the right to housing, and having it in Quebec would have a direct effect. If something is the law, usually you have to do something to comply with it, especially if you're the government. I don't quite believe that our current government, not to get all political and stuff here, would take that seriously. I think with or without it, it is a common belief that housing is a right, that housing is a basic need. And just like many other systemic issues that we have, denying or ignoring the fact that we have them seems to often be the status quo, not with just this current government, but with governments we've had in the past and governments we have now. So I think it would have an effect on projects that I work on. I think it would have an effect in the future, because you have to, in some way, show that you're in good faith. When something new comes up, you have to, as a politician, as a party, say, we are trying. But as Emily said, it's you have to do it the best way possible and the best time possible. What does that mean? I don't think it means much, depending on the actors that are there. But I definitely think that as policymakers and policy activists, it brings a giant advantage of being able to push further. If you have something put into law, if you have something move forwards, then often you can move further instead of moving backwards. Will it be applied? Will it be put in use? That's always the great big question. And that's essentially what we're doing for the registry project, is we are doing it for them so that there's no excuses left. But the opportunities, we say this almost every day at work, the chances of us getting that much money from the federal government to essentially kill profit are never going to come again. And we're very lucky that we have this opportunity. And I think it would be an incredible advancement, and it would be to everyone's advantage. But how much we'll be able to go forwards with 90 out of 125 seats in our current government, that I don't know. But hopefully that will change.
Just want to give you, just give you an example of how your question, if we had law, could be different. I work with some two institutions that you might know of, ceux qui sont en criminologie ou ceux qui l'Institut Leclerc et Bordeaux, which are the two provincial corrections institutions that are not too far there on the island of Montreal. So c'est 2 ans et 1 jour. So most of the individuals that go through corrections on a provincial level, when they finish their term or they pay their debt, more often than not, their only option other than family is homelessness. So imagine if we had law that would put an obligation on the part of Institut Leclerc for women in Bordeaux, where they are obligated to have their income taxes done to get access potentially to social housing, to be able to get access to welfare as soon as they leave these institutions. What is happening today is completely nonsensical. As soon as they leave, they're completely naked. They have nothing other than a bus ticket. Imagine if law would come and say, as a corrections facility, you have the legal obligation to recognize these individuals as citizens and to be able to put in motion any kind of rehabilitation so that they don't find themselves in homelessness. Today, when you look at shelter environments, more than 60% of the individuals that are in shelter environments have a criminal past. Not because they want to find themselves in a shelter, because they don't have any other options. No.
And the kinds of laws that George is referring to already also exist in other jurisdictions, there's like Wales and England and Scotland, who have variations of it, but this idea of the duty to assist. And so there's these types of laws, like in Wales, it's the duty to assist, and it requires the government to take reasonable steps to guide a person towards resources and prevent them from experiencing homelessness. I think in the UK, it's more targeted at institutions. So it forces public institutions like correctional facilities, mental health facilities, youth protection, requires them to assess risks of homelessness and then to take all reasonable steps to help prevent it by guiding them towards, relevant resources so that they remain housed. At the moment, we don't have anything like that here, but those kinds of public institutions are like major generators of homelessness because of the lack of those kinds of supports. So there are models that exist in other jurisdictions that we can look at, and I think those are the kinds of laws or sort of legislative models that we can draw inspiration from to say, is this something that we can do here? I'm actually partnering with Laurent, who's right over there, to do some research on this. And I think there could be some things.
Is there any link in Wales and these other places that have, I guess, applied the right to housing to not just institutions, but social security checks, for example, or social security programs? Have there been links? Like, for example, in Quebec, and we've talked about this, but a couple that is on social security makes at the minimum, and I would say like most of the time, $21,833 a year, a couple, two people.
What program are you talking
The
about?
social, l'assistance,
Oh, you mean welfare?
yeah, welfare, sorry.
I actually have a really interesting story about that from New York, and then I want to give a couple examples
Yeah.
here. Many years ago, I think in the 90s, it just so happened that the way the welfare law was written in the state of New York required like that the welfare check cover certain things. It was housing and food and other. But if it, right,
Yeah.
so, so at that point, actually, if you were a family of three, $286 a month was housing, right, which is a joke. Rent was about, at that time, 900 something, I would say. And so Legal Aid Society brought a lawsuit against the state of New York. It's called Jiggets. And they said, you must provide what the average housing cost is for people. And they had all these studies. The lawsuit went on for 15 years. And they got an injunction, and the injunction required that anytime someone was being evicted for non-payment of rent and they were on welfare, that welfare had to issue the rent arrears and pay them that amount so that they could pay their rent every month. It was huge. It was absolutely huge. Everyone was applying for Jiggets. They had the shortened kind of form, which was basically joining into the injunction. And I remember one person coming to my office and asking if they can join the Gigolo program. That was pretty funny. And it was actually, the landlords loved it too, because they were getting all the money. And this went on, and it was just because of the way in which that law happened to be written that it created this requirement, so we could have requirements like that too, which will affect a lot of different laws, because the amount of people get on welfare it's pathetic. Now, if we had a law also that required people to get a decent amount of money to live, but there are also small things that can change here. Like, for instance, I don't know how much people know about how housing law works, how the civil code works in relation to non-payment of rent, for instance. you're 3 weeks late on your rent. And at the time of the judgment of the decision, you're found to be 3 weeks late on your rent, you get evicted. There's nothing that you can do. You can pay the next day. Doesn't matter. Landlord takes your money, evicts you anyway. If they had just one tiny thing that says, and now you have 15 days to pay the debt. Just something as simple as that, because people walk into that situation with a disagreement, thinking they don't owe the money or they owe less. They don't pay it. They don't know. And then they get evicted when they could just, they might be able to come up with the money if they had 15 days. You know, a tiny change like that, if they allow tenants to counterclaim for repairs, for damages and rent reduction because of lack of repairs, and that would be an abatement on their rent. Imagine the impact that could have. And the third thing I'm just going to mention is the elimination of Article 1959 of the Code Civil, which allows tenants or landlords to not renew leases because they want to subdivide the apartment, enlarge the apartment, or change its destination, which some landlords are taking to mean, I want to have an Airbnb in your apartment, okay? So, and a tenant in that situation, it's weird because if you're served with repossession, with the notice of repossession, and you don't say anything, that means no, and the landlord has to go to the tribunal. But if you get this other type of case, it's the tenant who has to go to the tribunal. If you don't know that, because maybe you know about repossession, you blow it. It's like, it's 1 month later, and if you haven't fought the case, you get evicted, whether the landlord's in good faith or not. And if you try to bring the case, well, you can't actually. I don't know if everyone knows about the fact that the TAL is closed. Like, you can't actually walk in and bring a case. You have to do it online. And many of our service users, they don't have computers. They don't have, like, a landlord, if they want to bring a case online, it's actually easy. All the forms are set up. They just type it up and it goes in. A tenant, they don't have that for the tenants. You have to download it, fill it out, sign it, scan it, upload it. No one has this equipment. Who's sitting with a scanner in their house is about to be evicted anyway. And so, okay, so you call and you try to, no, you can't get through because you can't get through to any of the government right now. You can't walk in. You could try to make an appointment online, but maybe the appointment's going to be when your delay is passed. So everything is set against, the tenant. So we're trying to get them to get rid of 1959 altogether because it doesn't serve anyone's purpose. And of course, the last thing is rent control, but I mentioned that.
And even like to jump off what Sue's saying, it's like sometimes we have really great laws on the books, but we need people like mutual lawyers and advocates and activists to like make sure that those are being honored. Like in the Quebec Charter, I have great things to say about the Quebec Charter. There's great stuff in there, but we're not always honoring it. So there is, I think it's Article 45 or Section 45, and it's talking about how everyone who's in need has a right to social assistance or financial assistance for an adequate standard of living. Our social assistance is far from allowing people to have an adequate standard of living. It's, I think for a single person, it ends up being like $800 a month, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
That's not possible.
Yeah.
Like the average rent in Montreal is over $900. It's probably far higher than that. So at the moment, sure, we have this great law that says everyone has right to financial assistance for an adequate standard of living, but we're not honoring that. And I think that's where like folks like you, when you're going out into your professions, to say like, we always need to push to make sure that those laws, yeah, they're there, but that we're actually making sure that the government is meeting those kinds of obligations.
Thank you so much. All right, I had one last question, but I'd actually would rather open it up for questions from you all. So maybe we'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A. So did anybody have?
I actually have some questions about the 2019 National Strategy on Housing Act and the Federal Advocate on the Housing aspect. But I understand that that's at the federal level, and you're talking about the need to have a right to housing at the provincial level. And I'm wondering if you guys can kind of speak to that distinction and how that is out. And then in that case, I guess also what is the relevance or what work can the federal housing advocate actually do if it really is more of a provincial and territorial role. And you've also mentioned that it is systemic, the complaints that can be made at that level. I know it's, a new office. So I don't know if any complaints have gone through the process of being evaluated or recommendation for anything yet. But I'm just wondering if its establishment has changed any of your work at all. Impacted the discussions you're having or the decisions that are being made as you're working. And also, I guess maybe it's not actually because it seems like there are already some. And so I guess my comment about it is, isn't it fun that the federal government needs to add some? But anyways, that's my comment. And the question.
I can jump in on that. Yeah, so that was passed in 2019. And I mean, housing falls typically, like most stuff around housing falls within provincial jurisdiction. But this was a way of the federal government. It was part of their national housing strategy, which allocated like billions of dollars towards housing. And so part of that, they also passed an act to recognize the right to housing. And the federal housing advocate, she was only appointed last year. So she's only like a year into her mandate. So it's really new. And though the federal government doesn't have a ton of jurisdiction over housing, they do provide like a core amount of the funding for it. So through the national housing strategy, they allocate funding to the territories and provinces. Different provinces have different funding agreements. Quebec, it took years to get the funding for it because Quebec really wanted to be a part of allocating it. They don't allow it to go straight from the feds to like community groups, for example, let's go through the provincial government. Other provinces do so much. So I think the reason it matters at a federal level is because a lot of the funding comes from that. So it comes with obligation to help realize that. One of the key criticisms that has come out of the strategy is they're saying, hey, look, we're funding tons of housing projects. Sure, but they're like really expensive private rentals. So that's not really going to solve our housing crisis. And I think that's where the federal housing advocate's role becomes interesting. She's like the watchdog, right? So she's already received a lot of these kind of reports. So what's interesting is any of you, I actually encourage you to check it out. Their website, you can go online and have this like pretty user-friendly platform where you as an individual can make an observation or a complaint about a housing issue that you faced. But community groups like Project Genesis could, Vive could, OVM could all make like a report to say like, these are the people that we're working with. These are some of the systemic issues that we're seeing, and these are the recommendations that we make. And then her office looks at those, and then we'll issue, recommendations based on that. But we have a watchdog already, say for like the rights of prisoners, who's been around for a long time. Changes in correctional facilities take forever. It'll be the same probably with housing, but I think it's good to have someone who's sort of meant to be, and she comes from the grassroots sector. She's been an activist for many years. So I think it's important to have that kind of watchdog role to be able to have a little bit more accountability. But I think the reason we want to have something similar, maybe different, but something similar like that in Quebec is because so much of the housing issues fall within provincial jurisdiction. So Maggie, she can make recommendations, but those aren't binding on the provincial government or municipalities. So I think it'd be interesting to have something similar here in Quebec where people can make those kinds of claims, can issue recommendations, and more importantly, just have more transparency and accountability. But I think it's a really strong framework to have, but I think it's frustrating for people who need like relief now. So a tenant who's facing eviction, like this is not going to help them immediately. They're more long-term solution. Yeah.
Anybody wanted to add anything or?
Just that money, yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is gonna help us get more money from social housing. That's the only thing I can see, but yeah, it's not gonna, I don't see it changing. If we have one here, sure. And people, I don't know if this is related at all, maybe you can tell me, but everyone, we have this now Canada $500 subsidy that people can get. That might be related to this, but $500 is at like maybe half a month's rent. So I don't know what kind of an impact that's really gonna have, but money's good. That would be better to have a person in Quebec where you actually are making the laws, so. Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll take two at once. So, Chloe and Zaytuna.
My question is about the idea of the financialization of the housing market and how to talk about that, because I mean, to me, that's like the core of the issue, like if rent keeps going up, even if social assistance does keep pace, all that money is just one, back to just exaggerating inequalities, and also the average, another person who's not on social assistance also can't pay rent or is paying 50% of their income for rent. So what are some of the policy solutions that can be used to like push back on that? Also acknowledging that it's complicated because it's related to like increasing housing supply and needing money for that. And also people's retirement funds, but we kind of navigate those policy traps.
But I feel like a lot of the focus has been really beneficial, and on mentioned things and also moving away from sort of treating it once they're there. But I worked in a couple of different environments with homeless populations here in Montreal, and also in Montreal. And I think what's been really interesting to me to see is how once people are sort of at that place of being homeless, it's really important for a number of people to transition back and living on their own, living independently, because a lot of homeless people develop these communities and just improve them. I've seen it firsthand where they have access to housing and they have support from social workers, but being able to maintain that sort of responsibility that comes with living on their own again is really difficult. So I'm curious, I guess, about in terms of the transition back into the housing being available, whether holistic supports and services and strategies to help individuals struggling with mental health issues or a range of different challenges to maintain that, I guess, that quality of life and that ability to live. And also, I guess, I'm curious about alternatives as well to housing in the sense of like hospices and communal living spaces, because I think the socializing this is one of the communities can also be challenging. Yeah.
Okay, so we have two diverse questions, one on financialization and the other on like transitions into housing and alternatives. So maybe Georgia and Alana, if you wanted to start with either one.
Yeah, I want to answer both, but in a very straightforward manner. I don't think that there's a quick fix to the question that you're asking, but what I've seen over my experience is that it's very difficult to get social housing. And we need social housing in Canada more than, and over the course of the 1990s, there's been a radical drop in funding in terms of social housing. There's a part of the population that do need social housing, and we see that each year that the funding was not present, we were lacking in terms of our capacity to be able to build. So with those years of with this lack of funding, the problem only got bigger and bigger. And for us to be able to reach the plateau that we need in terms of social housing, it's going to need that push. So if I put aside the issue of la financiarisation, and I simply look at what I can do on a national level, I would tell you that the biggest push that we need is social housing. So that's one answer. There are other answers, but that's what I see on a regular basis. To answer your question, the other part of the solution is we've been talking over the last hour in terms of housing, but there's also the issue of psychosocial support. If you're not able to fund psychosocial support to maintain individuals inside their environment, to create a sense of home, to be able to give them the hope in a more holistic way, you're not going to do anything. You're only offering a box for individuals to stay in, but you're not offering them an alternative life to live. So I think that one of the core issues that I have, not necessarily advocacy, but it's being able to create this momentum for an individual to know that he can pick up the phone and call someone and say, I have an issue. He might call Project Genesis because there are issues, or he might call someone simply because he's feeling alone. And what we've seen, and there's a reduction in the amount of money that is being sent to individuals when we're saying, oh, he's housed. That's it. We don't need to do anything anymore. But in reality, for them to be maintained and to be able to prosper, you need to be able to offer funding And unfortunately, the only people that are doing that is the CUs, that is more often than not stretched to the limit, and community organizations that are finding it even more difficult to be able to help individuals that need specialized care. So I think we are between the housing crisis, there's another one, which is the psychosocial support that is desperately lacking. We need to be able to increase both at the same level for us to be able to see change.
To add to the question about the la financialisation, non plus, regarde, la financialisation, voilà, je sais parler français. About that, social housing, of course, I think in North America, we're very dead set on the American dream of the single unit family home with a yard. And that dream may prevent us from this like pretty harsh reality that we don't all need to be homeowners, that we don't all need to eventually move out of our apartment and have a house to ourselves. I think in Europe, social housing is much more common and much more accepted. You have doctors and lawyers and business executives and all that living in social housing in many countries, and it's perfectly normal and acceptable, and there is no social disdain attached to that idea. So bringing more social housing so much that anyone that wants to live in there can live in there. And obviously social housing, I'm talking about all out of market, non-market housing. So we're talking housing co-ops, we're talking des copropriétés divises, we're talking any sort of housing that is not privately owned and rented at a market price. Is a solution to fighting that as well. I think the advantage that these huge companies have is that they're playing exactly what I was getting to before, that game of, well, I'm game, are you? I will keep upping you, I will wait, I will put all these funds in order to keep making the market hike up. And who gets to stay in that market the more it goes up? It's them, and it's on purpose. It's a tactic to not just get tenants that can't pay as much out, but to get landlords that can't pay as much out of the market as well, so that they can have a monopoly and keep doing as they please and keep making profit. So jumping to building as much of that out of market housing as possible and taking away some of that disdain, you're essentially killing the speculation, or at least slowing it down. And by slowing down the speculation, you would then calm down the prices and make housing more attainable. If you slow the speculation, you also make homeownership more attainable as well, for young people who maybe have given up at this point on the dream of ever owning a condo with a bedroom, even if they work a good job and have saved up. So the speculation aspect of it, I think, is a really well-balanced argument to add to one of the many other solutions that would slow down that really slow, rapid, increase in the power that these financializations have. I think Adam might have so much more to add. No? Tu te retiens?
I'll keep it brief, but two things that come to mind. I think rent control can help not necessarily stop financialization, but at least try and prevent some of the worst harms of the effects of it, which is the rapidly rising rents. And then something that can be interesting that's at the municipal level, which the municipalities often are a little bit bound on what they can do around housing. But there's zoning. So like you could do zoning to try and protect nonprofit housing stock. And Montreal had tried to do that with what is the zoning or something, to say like X amount in any new development has to be for affordable housing. what does affordable housing mean is a whole other discussion. But then they left a giant loophole in that bylaw that you can like buy your way out of that effectively. So doing more like strong zoning regulations, which do fall under municipal powers to try and protect nonprofit housing stock, which would hopefully slow down the effects of financial eviction housing. Those are a couple of ideas there.
Yeah, and this is a moment when we have to recognize that property is a legal and social construct, and anything we say about it is what it is. You know, so like there are so many areas of the law that can act to make housing less of this profit-making enterprise, which creates this horrible thing where we have a society that's trying to balance someone's right to a home with someone else's supposed right to make $1 zillion. You're never going to get that balance right, because those two things shouldn't be on the same scale to begin with, right? So, you know, the zoning is a really good example. In Côte d'Ivoire, we don't have a problem so much with 1959s anymore, because the zoning rules said you're not allowed to subdivide them in large apartments. So landlords can't get the permits, so they can't do the evictions based on that. And I love what you were saying about this idea that we all have to go and have our houses with a yard. There's also a lot of education to be had here, and going, you know, why? Like that doesn't need to be the goal. We could be living collaboratively. We could have, you know, worker-owned factories and on tenant-owned buildings, and it doesn't have to be this business thing. It's just how we live. It's just what we're doing. And you know, I also just want to say something about your question as well, because housing, it affects all the areas affect each other. And when we talk about putting in place, you know, we need more social workers and doctors and medical care, and we need our other laws not to be hindering this, like welfare, for instance, has so many rules that try to keep people from being socially solidaire with each other. You know, it becomes suspect. If you're living with somebody else, are they your partner? You know, we're going to cut your welfare check because you're living with a partner. We had a young man come in, 24 years old, who was living with a friend of his aunt's because they couldn't make ends meet, either one of them. So they put the two together to share an apartment. And they asked him, are you sleeping with her? And she's like in her 40s. It's not like you can have a relationship, someone in their 20s, someone in their 50s, but he was so disgusted by the idea because he looks at this person like his aunt, right? That he just freaked out and didn't answer the question right. And now they're telling him, we're going to cut your welfare check unless you make her move out. Like, this is insane. Like, we're supposed to be encouraging people to help each other, not discouraging it. So we have to get our act together in all areas of law.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running a little low on time, and there might be a class after this. So maybe to just wrap up this panel, maybe in 1 or 2 sentences, I would love to hear, like, what are the, and we've talked about this throughout the panel, but what are the principles and values that guide your vision for affordable housing and for all in the work that you do?
Good question.
But only 1 or 2 sentences.
Makes it worse.
You ask the question again?
Yes. So what are the principles and values that guide your vision on your work for affordable housing for all?
I mean, I think I sort of just said it in a way that housing is a right. It's a human right. That if we're going to have a system that continues to have people owning other people's homes, that there have to be a lot of responsibilities that come with that. And that we should be moving towards a situation where we're not trying to balance the human right of housing with like this sort of capitalist right of making as much money as we possibly can to get out of that system to a better utopic system. That now my writing side is coming out, right? I write utopia.
I think I would echo that housing is a human right. Homelessness is a violation of many different fundamental human rights, right to dignity, right to health, right to security, right to life. And I think we all have a responsibility, and even just as renters, I'm sure many of you, most of you are renters, even one little thing that you can do is when you are leaving an apartment, consider doing a lease transfer. That can help keep rents down, because if you're doing a lease transfer, the landlord can't hike the rent. So trying to think of small little strategies, but like that we all have a role to play, I think, in ensuring that we have a livable housing market in Montreal.
Well, can I say one tiny thing? It's just the right in the registry. And when you leave the apartment, come back a few weeks later and tell the new tenant how much rent you were paying and give them a copy of your lease.
Or send them a birthday card and write, hey, I'm the old tenant, or just go put it in the registry and write them a note. So many solutions. On my end, I think, of course, housing is a right. Of course, you should all be doing your parts to protect the next person. But I think it goes beyond that. I think obviously community is very important, but I think mixity and like individuality is equally as important, in the sense that we're all very different and we may want the house, we may be okay with the apartment. Like it's okay to have different understandings, but I think it's in terms of housing, it's to remembering that if we are okay, we should be doing something to help the ones that aren't. I think often we forget, and it's kind of the joke at the office lately too, that La CAQ's motto is continuons, and just in general, like the law and the rules and the situations are often because people wanted to protect the status quo, because it's to their advantage, because they are comfortable. I think when it comes to my philosophy in housing, it's really just like, are you comfortable? Are you taking someone else's comfort? What can you do, and how can you teach others to raise that awareness and open their eyes and ears to see more? I think homelessness is so misunderstood still by so many, and so importantly, we forget that any of us could end up in a situation of homelessness. Many students have actually possibly been in one, going to work in BC and living in their car. Why do they live in their car? It's because they couldn't afford the rent for the summer. That's homelessness too. I think just being more aware and talking about it without bias and without shame is important to like make sure that everybody gets their share or what they need, which yes is different, but ultimately has to come down to something quite basic, which is feeling comfortable and feeling like you have a home at the end of the day.
So very quickly, two things that are part of my daily thinking process. One is, how can I reduce the trauma of the individuals that I meet? What can I do through legal means, through interpersonal skills, to be able to reduce trauma, to divert individuals so that they don't go through this cycle of chaos that I know because they've worked in it for more than 25 years. That's one thing. The other part that I think that is important for me to say to you, future lawyers, juristes, and whatever you do that is going to be great for Canada and Quebec, is to show kindness. Not necessarily the kindness that you think of, but to use your skills that you're developing right now and promote a sense of kindness. And this is something that is desperately lacking right now in the people that I meet, trying to convince them of doing things differently. I never talk about law. I never talk about advocacy. I'm saying, could you take 2 seconds, take a breather, and listen to what we have to say? So sometimes when I'm looking at you guys, I'm saying to myself, maybe I can have this small impact in terms of being kind. And that, before law, before anything, it makes a huge difference in the people that you meet, and you're going to try to help out.
Right. Thank you so much.
To give a formal conclusion, but I think we're running out of time. So I just wanted to say thank you to the panelists, Alana, George, Sue, and Emily. Thank you for dedicating your time out of your day to share your expertise, your knowledge, and just your wisdom to educate and engage all of us here. And also thank you everyone here for
showing up and engaging with these critical discussions, which we think at LPE McGill is very important to have these conversations and critical analysis of how the law actually impacts broader society and the markets and political realities. And just quickly, as Director of Communications for LPE McGill, I'm just going to plug in our social medias because we are a new club, and so we'd love to gain more traction and host more events like this to engage with students and practitioners. So in the email, there's links to that. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and thank you again for your time, everyone.
Thank you so much.